The most dangerous number in American housing is not the price of the house. It is the number the bank says you can afford. I have spent most of my life watching people confuse what they can buy with what they can carry. Those are not the same thing. A bank will approve a loan because it believes it can get paid back. It does not approve a loan because it wants you to sleep well at night. Build wealth. Invest for retirement, raise children without panic, or keep your marriage intact when one income gets shaky. The bank is asking one question: can this household keep the machine fed? You need to ask a different question. If I say yes to this house, what happens to the rest of my life? That is the real story of housing. In 2026, people think the housing crisis is a price story. It is not. It is a cash flow story. A family can survive a high sticker price if the monthly burden leaves them enough oxygen. A family can be ruined by a cheaper house if the payment eats their monthly oxygen and leaves nothing for savings, nothing for repairs, nothing for mistakes, nothing for opportunity. That is why I do not begin with the home price. I begin with the monthly oxygen test. If you do not understand that, you do not understand housing. In 2026, the median home price sits around $400,000. Mortgage rates hover near 6%, and millions of people are staring at listings that look normal until the payment shows up. That is where the fantasy ends. The American homebuyer is learning the same old lesson in a harsher form. The market does not care what you hoped homes would cost. The market cares what your income can carry after taxes, after insurance, after property taxes, after the invisible leaks. Nobody puts in the glossy mortgage advertisement. I have watched people do something foolish for decades. They use gross income to feel rich and net income to live poor. That is the first mechanism you must understand. I call it the gross income mirage. Gross income is the number that flatters you. It is the number people say at dinner. It is the number recruiters use. It is the number lenders underwrite. It is the number that makes a household earning $150,000 feel far safer than it actually is. But you do not spend gross income. You spend what lands in your checking account after taxes, after payroll deductions, after retirement contributions, after insurance, after all the little claws take their share before you ever touch a dollar. A family can say with complete honesty that it earns $150,000 a year and still feel cash poor every month. That is not because the family is stupid. It is because the family built its budget on a flattering number instead of a usable one. That is why I've never liked the way most people talk about affordability. The classic banking rule, the 28-36 rule, sounds respectable because it comes dressed in numbers. The idea is simple enough. Keep your housing payment around 28% of your gross monthly income and keep your total debt under 36% of gross. That rule can help a lender manage default risk. It does not protect your quality of life. It does not account for maintenance. It does not account for OA dues. It does not account for ugly insurance surprises. It does not account for a furnace dying, a roof leaking, a child needing braces, or your property taxes rising while your salary stays put. It tells the bank whether you probably can be milked. It does not tell you whether the house is wise. That is the second mechanism. I call it the qualification illusion. Approval creates false confidence. A lender says yes, and the buyer hears safe. But approval is not comfort. Approval is not margin. Approval is not resilience. Approval is not freedom. I have seen families become prisoners of respectable-looking numbers. They buy a house they technically qualify for, then spend the next 10 years protecting the mortgage instead of building a life. Every career decision is filtered through the payment. Every chance to invest is filtered through the payment. Every vacation is filtered through the payment. Every act of generosity is filtered through the payment. They do not own the house. The house owns the decision-making inside the family. That is why I prefer a harsher rule. I want total housing costs kept under 30% of net income whenever possible, not gross income. Net income, the money that actually arrives, if that number sounds demanding. Good, a house is not dangerous because it is expensive. A house is dangerous because it can quietly crowd out everything else that makes a life stable. Now let us run the numbers the adult way. Start with a $250,000 house. That price used to sound like a normal middle-class house in many parts of America. In some markets, it still is. In others, it barely exists. But use it as a starting point because it reveals the machinery clearly. At a 20% down payment, you need $50,000 in cash before the conversation even begins. Most people skip over that part as if $50,000 is merely a detail. It is not a detail. It is a gate. If you do not have it, you either wait, lower your target, or step into the expensive territory of a smaller down payment, private mortgage insurance, and thinner margins. People like to talk about monthly payments because they are easier to digest, but the down payment is the first brutality of housing math. It tells you who gets to enter the arena at all. Finance the remaining $200,000 at 6% over 30 years, and you land around $1,200 a month in principal and interest, add property taxes and insurance, and now you are living in a world closer to $1,500 to $1,700 a month. Use $1,600 as a sober estimate. The bank may say you can swing that with a gross income around $68,500 a year. That is the bank talking. I do not care what the bank says here. If you want that $1,600 to stay under 30% of net income, you need roughly $300 of net income a month, depending on your tax load. That points you towards something around $85,000 of gross annual income to carry the house with room to breathe. That is the first uncomfortable truth of 2026. A $250,000 house is not a low bar anymore. It is already asking for an income many households do not have. And that is before the HOA, before the surprise repair, before the furniture trap, before the yard tools, before the homeowner psychology that says now that I own this place, I should upgrade everything inside it. The house payment is never the whole payment. That is the third mechanism. I call it the ownership creep. The moment people close on a home, the spreadsheet lies to them in a new way. The principal and interest are visible. The ownership creep is invisible. Paint, landscaping, blinds, appliances, water heater, pest control, internet upgrades, security systems. A better couch because now the living room is bigger. A patio set because now there is a patio. A riding mower because now there is a yard. Owning a house invites 1,000 little spending decisions that each feel reasonable and together act like termites. This is why net income discipline matters. Now move to a $500,000 house. This is where the American buyer begins to collide with reality in a more public way. In many decent neighborhoods, $500,000 no longer buys luxury, it buys ordinary. That is what shocks people. They do not feel rich shopping at that price. They feel late. At 20% down, the entry ticket is $100,000 in cash. That alone removes an enormous number of households from the game. The median savings in America is nowhere near that. So when people ask who can buy $500,000 homes in 2026, the answer is not just people with higher income. It is also people with stored capital, family help, prior home equity, or a household structure strong enough to build cash fast. Finance $400,000 at 6% over 30 years and you are around $2,400 a month in principal and interest. Add taxes and insurance and you are staring at something like $2,800 to $3,000 all in. Use $3,000 as the working number because optimism has a way of showing up early and leaving late. On the Bank S gross income rule, you may qualify around $128,500 a year. Under my oxygen rule, you want closer to $10,000 of net income a month, which pushes gross household income toward $160,000 a year. Now the story changes. This is no longer an individual buyer story in most cases. It becomes a dual income household story, two $80,000 incomes, or one larger income plus another solid contributor. And even then, the household may not feel powerful, it may simply feel permitted. That distinction matters. A household bringing in $160,000 a year can still be fragile if the structure of the income is weak. One spouse in a cyclical industry, one commission, heavy roll, one household carrying student loans, car payments, child care costs, and thin savings. A high enough salary can hide a fragile operating system. That is the fourth mechanism. I call it the dual income fragility. People see two incomes and assume safety. But two incomes often mean the house only works if both engines keep running at full speed. That is not wealth. That is synchronized dependence. When a house requires both people to stay in motion, the home stops being shelter and becomes a performance contract. One layoff, one illness, one pregnancy complication, one aging parent, one burnout episode, one relocation demand, and the structure begins to tremble. This is where many families become house rich in appearance and option poor in reality. Then we reach the $1 million house. In much of the country, $1 million still buys something that looks like a triumph. In the coastal cities, it often buys normality with better branding. That is one of the great distortions of modern American housing. $1 million no longer signals extravagance in many markets. It often signals access. But the math does not care what social media has normalized. At 20% down, you need $200,000 in cash, then you finance $800,000. Principal and interest land around $4,796 a month. Add taxes and insurance, and $6,000 a month is a reasonable working figure. $6,000 a month for housing is not a vibe, it is a claim on your future. To keep that under the bank's 28% gross rule, you need something like $257,000 a year. To keep it under 30% of net, you need around $20,000 of net income each month, which points toward a gross household income around $320,000 a year, and depending on taxes and local conditions, more than that. Now, we are no longer in the realm of broad middle class aspiration. We are in the top slice of households. Roughly the top 5% are even in range to afford this comfortably. That is not a moral statement, it is a math statement. And this is where the fifth mechanism arrives. I call it coastal compression. In expensive markets, ordinary life gets priced like luxury. That is how $1 million home can still feel modest. The zip code compresses the meaning of money. What would buy a mansion in one region buys a condo in another. This creates a psychological trap. People stop evaluating homes by intrinsic utility and start evaluating them by local relativity. They say this is normal for here, of course it is, but local normality does not suspend financial arithmetic. A bad ratio in San Francisco is still a bad ratio. A stretched payment in Seattle is still stretched, $1 million. Dollar condo can damage a household just as effectively as a mansion would if the monthly oxygen is gone. The market does not become safer because everyone around you is also overpaying. That is crowd psychology, not prudence. Now, let us go one step higher to the $2 million house. This is where social media performs one of its favorite tricks. It makes extreme rarity feel socially common. Scroll long enough and a $2 million house starts to feel like a benchmark for adulthood. It is not. It is an elite income product. At 20% down, you need $400,000 in cash just to get in the door. Then you borrow $1.6 million. Principal and interest alone are around $9,590. $3 a month, add taxes, insurance, maintenance, perhaps AOA, and you are quickly in the range of $12,000 to $13,000 a month to keep that under the bank. Gross. Income rule, you need around $514,000 a year to keep it under 30% of net with a higher effective tax burden. You are closer to $700,000 in gross household income for comfort. That is not upper, middle class math. That is rare. Air math, only about 2% of American households can truly afford that level. And notice what happens to the conversation at this range. Budgeting matters less than bracket. At that level, the game is not clipping coupons. It is being in the right tax neighborhood, having the right asset base, the right reserves, the right compensation structure, the right bonus profile, the right stock grants, the right business ownership, the right capital cushion. That does not make those buyers immoral. It makes the structure honest. The buyer of a $2 million home is usually not solving a budgeting problem. The buyer is solving a wealth structure problem. And that leads to the deepest truth in all of this. The affordability crisis is not merely that homes are expensive. It is that the distance between wages and ownership has become too wide for rules of thumb to hide anymore. A $250,000 home asking for roughly $85,000 in gross income to feel comfortable. A $500,000 home asking for around $160,000. A $1 million home asking for roughly $320,000. A $2 million home asking for $700,000. Those numbers are not a political slogan. They are a brutal map of the modern gap between what shelter costs and what most households produce. And once you see the map clearly, you have a choice. You can keep asking what the bank will permit, or you can start asking what kind of life your income can actually defend. That is the identity flip most people need. You must stop thinking like an approved borrower and start thinking like the chief underwriter of your own life. Borrowers ask, can I get the loan? Underwriters ask, what breaks this deal? Borrowers ask, what is the monthly payment? Underwriters ask, what happens if one income disappears? Taxes rise, maintenance doubles, the roof fails, the car dies, childcare increases, or my industry gets weaker. Borrowers shop for permission, underwriters shop for endurance. That change in identity is where wisdom begins. I would rather see a family buy a smaller home with abundant oxygen than a larger home that turns every future decision into a referendum on keeping the lights on. There is no glory in making the maximum legal payment on a house while starving every other compounding engine in your life. A home can be part of wealth. It is not a substitute for wealth. That is where many intelligent people get trapped. They pour everything into a down payment, then all future surplus into the monthly burden. Then tell themselves they are building net worth because Zillow says the home is worth more. Maybe, maybe not. Equity is real eventually, but monthly cash flow is what determines whether you can survive long enough to benefit from it. You cannot eat appreciation. You cannot use paper gains to pay for a leaking foundation unless you refinance yourself deeper into the structure. You cannot tell a nervous spouse, do not worry. The estimate on the real estate app is up. Cash flow is what keeps dignity intact. So let me give you the operating system I would use if I were approaching housing in 2026 from scratch. First, build your housing number from net income, not gross. Start with the money that truly arrives, then work backward. If 30% of net feels tight because your life includes childcare, elder care, unstable bonuses, or lumpy business income, lower the target. The right percentage is the one that leaves room for reality. Second, treat the down payment as a readiness test, not an obstacle to be rushed through. If you can barely scrape together the down payment, you are not ready for the hidden costs of ownership. A buyer without reserves is not buying a home. He is buying exposure. Third, stress test the household on one income, if there are two incomes. Not because one income will certainly disappear, but because fragility hides in good times. If the house only works in a perfect labor market with two healthy adults and no disruptions, then the house is too large. Fourth, separate shelter from ego. A home should serve the family. It should not become an expensive costume designed to impress people who are not paying your bills. I have made a great deal of money by refusing to buy symbols at the price of substance. A smaller, wiser house with more liquidity often beats a larger, admired house with no margin. Fifth, remember that ownership costs do not stop at the mortgage. Build a reserve for maintenance before the house tells you to. Roofs do not negotiate with optimism. Water heaters do not care about your spreadsheet. Trees fall on weekends. Pipes burst on holidays. Sixth, understand your market without becoming hypnotized by it. If you live in a place where even ordinary shelter demands extraordinary income, then you face a strategic decision. Not just a shopping problem. Earn more, save longer, buy smaller, move farther out, delay ownership, or move markets entirely. People hate that last sentence because it feels unfair. Many things about housing are unfair. The market does not award points for emotional attachment to a zip code. Seventh, never let the house crowd out the assets that make you free. If homeownership forces you to stop investing, stop saving, stop building a business, or stop maintaining liquidity, you may be converting one asset into the enemy of every other asset. I am not anti-home. I am anti-delusion. A good home can stabilize a family, anchor a life, and quietly compound value over a long period. But a home bought under the wrong assumptions can become an elegant prison with a landscaped front yard. That is why I say again that the most dangerous number in American housing is not the home price. It is the number the bank says you can afford. The bank will lend against your income. You must protect your oxygen. The bank will hand you the maximum amount it believes can be extracted from your cash flow. You must decide how much of your future you are willing to hand over. That decision will shape more than your address. It will shape your marriage, your investing, your career flexibility, your risk tolerance, your capacity to say no, your ability to seize opportunity, and the quiet emotional tone inside your house for years. So when you look at a $250,000 home, do not ask whether the payment looks manageable in isolation. Ask whether you want to commit $85,000 of annual earning power to the life required to carry it comfortably. When you look at a $500,000 home, do not just admire the kitchen. Ask whether your household truly has the $160,000 of gross income, the reserve base, and the stability to sustain that payment without resentment. When you look at a $1 million home, do not let the neighborhood flatter you into forgetting that you are playing in a bracket reached by only a slim slice of America. When you look at a $2 million home, do not pretend you are solving an ordinary budgeting problem. Admit that you are making an elite capital allocation decision and treat it with the seriousness it deserves, because houses do not bankrupt families only through foreclosures. They bankrupt families through compromised decades. through years of no investing, through marriages strained by money, through careers people are afraid to leave, through emergencies that arrive in houses with no reserves, through children watching parents live in a beautiful box with permanent financial tension inside it. That is the cost nobody includes in the mortgage calculator, and that is why I would rather live below my ceiling and above my stress. I would rather own a house that leaves me room to invest, room to think, room to wait, room to act, room to absorb surprise, and room to remain rational when the world gets noisy. A wise house protects your life. A foolish house consumes it. That is the test. Not whether a lender says yes, not whether a realtor says this is what everyone is doing, not whether a city has normalized absurdity, not whether your friends call it a stretch worth making. The real test is whether the house strengthens your future or rents it back to you month by month. That is the threshold in 2026. And every buyer now stands in front of the same mirror. You can buy the biggest life the bank will tolerate, or you can buy the life your cash flow can truly defend. One path gives you an address, the other gives you endurance. If you choose wrong, the house will collect from you for 30 years. If you choose right, the house will simply be where your life happens while your freedom compounds in the background.